In 2017, boutique retro console maker Analog released the NT Mini, an NES and Famicom alternative that uses modern technology and smart engineering in a way that makes it fundamentally different from software emulators and traditional clone consoles. Now in 2018, we've got our hands on the next logical step, the Super NT, which, despite being much more powerful, comes in at less than half the cost of the NT Mini. Analog was confident enough to let us spend a month and a half putting the final hardware through its paces, providing us with all variations for review. And we even had a chance to go behind the scenes with FPGA engineer Kevin Horton.
Absolute cycle accuracy. Everything happens in real time. All the timing, latency, it's as close as you can get to original hardware on something modern. Back in the early 90s, I was hoping someone would come up with a chip like an FPGA.
It started with the Commodore 64. At a time when information about programming and computer hardware was hard to come by, Kevin Horton, known online as Kevtris, got his start with projects like building his own EEPROM programmer and turning an old printer into a vector plotter.
I always really liked the Commodore 64 music, and I was thinking of ways to kind of generate it or save it.
This idea led Kevtris to create many devices that could play back game music in a hardware-accurate fashion, but mostly for his own enjoyment. This is where FPGAs come in. An FPGA is a digital integrated circuit that is fully customizable, capable of being written and rewritten into whatever configuration is needed, and then installed into a mass-produced circuit board. The decreasing cost of FPGAs in recent years has now made it possible for Kevtris to distribute his work without the need to build complex devices made up of countless components. The FPGA itself can even work as the sum of the parts of a pre-existing hardware configuration, such as a game console, and potentially add features on top of that.
I wanted to develop an FPGA video game system 10 years ago, but no one was gonna pay, you know? That was my big problem, is up until now, you know, nobody's really wanted to pay the price for a system.
With the emergence of systems like the AVS by Retro USB, this sort of hardware has finally become accessible to the broader retro gaming community. Analog sought out Kevtris' experience for their own FPGA-based NES and Famicom console, the NT Mini. The end result was actually the long-awaited implementation of NES FPGA work that Kevtris had completed years earlier.
I pretty much finished it in about 2005 or 6, so it's pretty much what was done back then. That NSF player, that was put in way back then, so I'm happy that finally got released, you know, so people can actually use that, because that was an internal thing for me only.
As the original systems age and become more difficult to maintain over the coming decades, many feel that FPGAs could be the future of preserving classic games in a hardware-accurate environment. For now, we'll just have to see where this path leads. While no one can be certain that Kevtris' work is 100% faithful to the originals, his attention to detail cannot be doubted. The NT Mini, for example, replicates every component of the NES, all the way down to the exact pattern of its messy composite output, if that's how you actually want to play it. While incredible things have been done in the world of software emulation, only a hardware solution like an FPGA can interact with a cartridge at the same pace as original hardware.
You can do cycle accurate, but you can't do the same type of latency. Usually on an emulator, everything's processed in batches. The problem is you have to read the cartridge periodically, you know, pretty much. You can't bulk read memory because it's too slow. You know, the ROM is only going to give you the data at that rate.
Everyone assumed that Analog's next system would be an FPGA with a Super Nintendo core, or at least that's what they were hoping for. Given the huge jump in complexity from the NES to SNES, Kevtris thought he couldn't deliver a finished product within Analog's desired timetable. But he surprised even himself and developed a fully functioning SNES core in only 6 months.
You break it down into the smallest parts possible, and then you work on each part one at a time.
To identify issues with each piece he reverse engineered, Kevtris paired up his FPGA versions with original SNES chips on test boards. If something wasn't working right, he knew exactly which piece needed more work.
The PPU was a pushover. I was kind of disappointed, actually.
As with most game consoles, SNES systems can be quite different on the inside, even if they look similar on the outside. Around 1995, Nintendo made sweeping changes to how the SNES console would be manufactured going forward. Because they consolidated CPU and PPU functions into a single chip, these boards are labeled one chip. They're highly coveted in the retro gaming community for their significantly sharper video output compared to earlier systems. However, there are some trade-offs, namely overblown video levels and minor glitches that show up in a small handful of titles. They may be Super Nintendos, but some consider them to be official clone consoles. The Super NT, then, being based on the earlier chip design, is almost a paradox. Some might argue that it's more of a true SNES than some of Nintendo's own machines.
It's based on a 213 model, which is a Rev 2 CPU, Rev 1 PPU1, and a Rev 3 PPU2, which is by far the most common.
Ironically, Super Turrican, the director's cut being one of 2 Factor 5 games included with the Super NT, is known for severe sound glitches on one-chip consoles. Flashcards like the Super EverDrive and Super UFO are supported. There has been a lot of discussion recently about poorly designed flashcards or reproduction cards and whether they could damage your consoles, but Keptris isn't worried.
Oh, it won't hurt the Super NT.
Even the MSU1 chip in the popular ST to SNES works, which allows for streaming audio and other impressive feats.
I couldn't believe it worked. It does.
In fact, Keptris didn't have to do anything special to get unusual cartridges to interface with the Super NT.
I have the Sufami Turbo, that works. The Game Saver Plus worked. Dr. SF6 worked. Basically anything I plugged in there's worked. I've tested all the expansion chips. I actually bought all those cartridges off of eBay to test those.
Speaking of cartridges, the NES slot on the NT Mini was exceedingly temperamental, at least on our unit, but the Super NT has given us absolutely no trouble with any cartridge that was at least passably clean. We did report a few issues during our own pre-release testing. The most difficult issues that Keptris ran into during development involved games using direct memory access, or DMA functions, in ways that are fundamentally broken, but ended up working anyway.
You know, my DMA was too good. So I had to, so I'd play a game and, something wouldn't be right, and then I'd have to look through and figure out why, and come to find out most of the time it was because the game did something with the DMA that it wasn't supposed to do.
Thankfully, Keptris was able to address these problems well before the Super NT hardware was in our hands. He has also fixed the scant few visual and audio glitches that we discovered, with the one exception being some curious behavior with the high-res mode in Japanese exclusive Marvelous, but he now has the cartridge and is on the case. We checked several other games that use the SNES high-res graphics and did not encounter any similar issues. As the Super NT is tested by thousands of other SNES fans, it could still take a bit of time before bugs are squashed as thoroughly as with high-end software emulators, like Higan, which have the advantage of having been around for many years. But based on what we've seen, virtually every game already seems to work exactly like you'd hope.
It's going to be very, very minor stuff. I did a fairly extensive testing, days and days running all the games.
Eliminating lag in every aspect of the system was one of the key goals of the Super NT as well as the NT Mini.
The input latency is identical to original systems because the controllers are read in the same way. So there's zero latency there. There's no USB overhead, for example. There's no operating system overhead. And then the video rendering is all in real time. So with the zero lag mode, everything is all in sync with the video generation, so there's no lag.
Of course, one big difference between the NT Mini and the Super NT is the newer system is HDMI only.
The cost of adding analog was just, too much. You'd have to have a DAC and then the connectors, and it made the system bigger too.
However, thanks to the fact that there's no delay between the render and the HDMI port, Analog has a unique opportunity to turn, analog output into an external option instead. Analog is planning to release an adapter that takes a proprietary signal from the HDMI ports of their own consoles and turn it into the same quality of 240p analog signal that the NT Mini's built-in port provides, which is good news for light gun fans.
The Super Scope would work on that.
Honestly, we can't argue against the decision to provide analog as an external option. because the best thing about the Super NT is that they managed to squeeze it down to just under $200, well under half of the NT Mini's $450. Yeah, I mean, that's not exactly peanuts, but it also means that a lot more people can get their hands on it. And if FPGAs really are to become a revolution in how retro games are played, then price and accessibility must be top priorities.
The Super NT has a bigger FPGA and more RAM than the NT Mini, which makes possible many features that we felt were missing from its predecessor. If you're not a fan of the newfangled font, choose alternate font in the system menu for a more traditional sort of retro text. You can also change menu animations, LED behavior, and more. You can choose between NTSC and PAL in the hardware menu. PAL cartridges may refuse to load if the system is set to NTSC, but interestingly, once it's booted, you can switch regions, which adjust the speed in real time, so you can run PAL carts at a smooth 60 Hz. However, don't get too excited, because if gameplay was adjusted for a PAL version, then it will play too fast in NTSC mode, and likewise NTSC carts will play too slow in PAL mode. But you may be able to use NTSC mode to run certain unoptimized PAL versions in a manner similar to their NTSC counterparts. But more to the point, let's dig into video settings. Resolution options run the expected gamut of 480p through 1080p.
4K really isn't doable right now. There's no chips that support it. It's too many pixels per second.
Thankfully, so long as your 4K TV does a good job of upscaling 1080p or 720p, the results are still quite good. In fact, you may want to choose 720p over 1080p, specifically if you're a fan of the scanline look. As is the case with many retro upscaling techniques, the Super NT's scanline thickness looks a bit more authentic in 720p, and the softness feels more CRT-like. The Gamma Boost is a nice new feature that we had specifically wished was in the NT Mini. This helps compensate for the darkened image when using the scanlines feature. Be sure to set a vertical integer scale, or else the scanline spacing will be screwed up. You can adjust this in the screen size menu, which offers some basic height and aspect ratio presets, although at this time we feel the list needs some tweaks and additional options that we've suggested and hope might be implemented. The good news is that there is a way to scale the image however you like, independent of the screen size menu, but before we get into that, we have to talk about integer scaling and interpolation. In some ways, integer scaling is not as crucial for the Super NT as it is for similar systems, including the NT Mini. The simplest way to upscale low-res graphics is to use hard-edged lines. This is fine when each axis is scaled by an integer like 4x and 5x, but to get the correct aspect ratio, you would need a non-integer scale. Due to uneven pixel sizing, this can cause shimmering as the screen scrolls, as demonstrated here by the NES Classic Edition. Thankfully, Nintendo themselves fixed this with the Super Nintendo Classic Edition by adding interpolation to the horizontal axis, which results in smooth scrolling at the correct aspect ratio. And the Super NT's upgraded FPGA allowed Kevtris to implement his own version.
The scaler in there, I spent about a month and a half developing it. So it's kind of like a FrameMeister and more.
In short, interpolation calculates missing states between defined values. The end result in this case is that the horizontal and vertical axes are interpolated so that instead of varying pixel sizes, each line has just a slightly soft edge so that all rows and columns appear uniform. This means that you can use, say, 4.5x vertical sizing with the correct 4:3 aspect ratio and get absolutely no shimmering. Kevtris tells us that interpolation was for him a high priority feature, and by our estimation, the implementation is very high quality, making it, we feel, the most important graphical feature of the Super NT, and one that we hope to see on all of Analog and Kevtris' work going forward. You can, by the way, disable interpolation in the scaler menu. When we first received the Super NT, it was a single toggle for both axes, but they implemented a bit of our feedback, and the firmware available at launch has separate toggles for horizontal and vertical interpolation. At 1080p, disabling vertical interpolation has almost no perceptible effect, but at 720p as well as 480p, it is quite nice to disable only vertical interpolation to get sharp-edged lines while still enjoying shimmer-free scrolling. Since most footage in this episode was recorded at 1080p, we decided to leave interpolation enabled for both horizontal and vertical axes so that we could take full advantage of the system's advanced scaling features, which you can access by activating the advanced mode toggle, which brings us even more fun and excitement. Alongside multiple extra options, screen size is replaced by width and height. Since we left interpolation on, there's no reason for us to not fill the screen however we like. Here are the settings we dialed in, which completely fills the vertical 1080p space in games with no letterboxes, perfectly centers every game we tested, and the aspect ratio is based on my PVM 20L5. If you want to turn off interpolation for a sharper image and use integer scales instead, we recommend a height of 1200 and a width of 1536, or a height of 960 with a width of 1280. The Extra Features menu has a few toggles that make minor alterations to SNES rendering behavior to improve visuals in specific situations. The most interesting is pseudo high-res blending. Sometimes the SNES 512 pixel wide mode might be used as a striped pattern on an overlapping layer. On a consumer-grade CRT, this might blend to look like a sort of transparency, but the Super NT can turn it into true transparency, which works great in Kirby's Dream Land 3. None of the features of the Super NT do anything like reduce slowdown. For better or worse, slowdown appears to occur in just the same way as a real SNES. Right after interpolation, we'd say that the most exciting new feature to the Super NT that the NT Mini could not have are buffer options. By default, zero delay is enabled. What this means is that there is absolutely no delay on the HDMI output. Everything is rendered and output in real time, so if you have a low lag TV or monitor, then you can get a nearly CRT-like experience. But there is a quirk to the zero delay mode that is also shared by the NT Mini and High Def NES. The NES and SNES both run at a speed a bit over 60 Hz. The OSSC reads it as 60.08 Hz, which isn't a problem at all in the analog realm. But to ensure maximum compatibility with digital displays, the Super NT actually runs a bit downclocked so that it can hit an even 60 Hz. It's not something that any human being is likely to actually perceive. I mean, over the course of 10 minutes, the Super NT loses only about 1 second, but it is a small thing that makes it just the teensiest touch removed from original hardware.
Well, there's a frame buffer now. So a frame buffer gives me a lot more options.
By choosing fully buffered, the Super NT runs at the SNES's original slightly faster than 60 Hz speed, while still outputting an even 60 Hz. There are two small trade-offs. First, a bit of lag that is never more than 1 frame.
It varies from 0 to 16 milliseconds in wraps. It's a sawtooth.
Second, a frame must be dropped approximately every 10 seconds to stay matched up to the 60 Hz output. An alternative is single buffer, which is supposed to be less lag, but rather than dropping a frame causes a screen tear to roll up the screen about every 10 seconds instead. Audio options are pretty simple. If you're using a cartridge with analog audio pass-through, then you need to activate the analog to digital converter manually. To our knowledge, this is only relevant for 2 types of cartridges: the previously mentioned SD2SNES with its MSU1 chip, and the Super Game Boy. The Super Game Boy itself is responsible for the game's audio processing, which is passed through the cartridge as analog. If the cartridge audio were not activated, then you'd only hear sounds that are processed by the SNES. With cartridge audio activated, you may hear a fair bit of noise, most noticeable on silent screens.
You're hearing the CPU bus noise on the Super Game Boy is what you're hearing. You can hear it on a regular Game Boy if you have headphones and turn it up, you can hear it too.
It is much harder to hear this noise when playing with analog output on a real SNES, but if you balance the cartridge audio with your sound system volume, you can hopefully find a satisfactory balance between audible game sound and low noise levels. It's really fascinating to consider the Super Game Boy when it comes to the Super NT, seen as how it's real Game Boy hardware in a cartridge. Whether you play through an SNES or a Super NT, you're still playing a true Game Boy. To get the correct sizing for Game Boy games, you should set the Super NT to a square pixel aspect ratio like 5x vertical and 5x horizontal, something that's actually a bit easier to achieve here compared to analog output from a real SNES. But as you may know, there are some drawbacks to the Super Game Boy in terms of accuracy. It was designed to use a crystal oscillator to run at a Game Boy's true speed, but to save cost, the final product derives its speed from the SNES system clock instead. The result is that Game Boy games run faster than intended, and you may notice frequent stutters as the screen scrolls. However, the Japan-exclusive Super Game Boy 2 greatly alleviates these problems by including the crystal oscillator to not only run the Game Boy hardware at the correct speed, but also reduce stuttering significantly. This is interesting for the Super NT for two reasons. First, while the original Super Game Boy is controlled by the cartridge bus in the Super NT, just as with a real SNES, in this case losing just a bit of speed in the zero lag mode, but not much, Super Game Boy 2 speed is completely unaffected by the Super NT system, making it a totally accurate original Game Boy hardware solution. Second, the Super Game Boy 2 stutters even less when played in the Super NT's zero lag mode. There is still a frame hitch every several seconds. Game Boy speed just doesn't quite sync up to 60 Hz, but our tests show that it is less frequent than on a real SNES. Regardless of your feelings over whether an FPGA is as valid as original hardware, this still qualifies as a true Game Boy hardware setup that, in this case, performs just a bit better via the Super NT and at the correct speed. We can't help but wish that maybe in the future we could see the ability to scale up to 7x for Game Boy games, or perhaps even some Super Game Boy optimized modes to eliminate stutter altogether. It feels like there's potential here to make the ultimate interface for playing pre-Game Boy Color titles with real hardware on your TV, if Analog and Kevtris wanted to make it happen.
Of course, the Super NT has only just been released, so we're hopeful that its features will be refined and expanded upon as time goes on.
Oh yeah, there's plenty of extra space on that FPGA, which is nice. So on the NT Mini, I ran out of space.
The Super Famicom was released nearly 30 years ago, more than ancient in computing terms. It may have some of the most revered and polished 2D games ever made, but you have to wonder if the guy who finished reverse engineering it even likes it.
It's really awesome hardware, I think. I mean, they did a very, very good job of it. You know, I can't easily go back to NES so much anymore. So, no, I think this is about the peak for a 2D system. I would say it would be the peak.
But does it have blast processing?
The CPU bus is 8 bits. You know, on the Genesis, it's 16 bits. But, you know, it can execute memory reads and writes every single cycle. In the Genesis, it takes 8 cycles to do it.
The SNES does have 16-bit video if you consider that 2 8-bit VRAMs work in parallel. But just how far can we take FPGA gaming hardware?
PlayStation 1, Neo Geo, that would be about it.
One of the systems that seems to be on everyone's mind, the N64, with fantasies of hardware-accurate FPGA consoles that might even render at a higher resolution or with better frame rates. But even if an FPGA were powerful enough to do it one day, you might not want to hold your breath.
It would be very difficult, I think. The problem is the complexity, you know, goes up a lot, much more complicated.
In the right hands, FPGA-based game consoles offer perhaps the most exciting alternatives to the real thing, while offering modern conveniences. But no matter how archaic a system may be, Kevtris remains doggedly committed to accuracy.
I replicate hardware behavior. I don't try to ask why it does it. I just say this is how it does it.
Kevtris was mum on whether he might see a return of his personal jailbreak firmware that he released for the NT Mini, which made it possible to load ROMs and other 8-bit cores that he had already developed. definitely a significant added value. Regardless of whether an unofficial feature like that materializes for the Super NT, we're already impressed with Analog's new direction, and hope that this trend continues through feature hardware. Compact, portable, great mechanical feel to the cartridge slot and controller ports, and optional analog support. The Super NT feels like a collection of smart ideas and small tweaks that add up to a more sensible and affordable piece of tech. So all we want to know now is, what's next?